Good day, dear students. The topic of our lecture today is phonetic characteristics of the text. Lecture number 7. Today we will speak about text linguistics in phonology, about intonation unity, about intonation structure of a monologue text, intonation of dialogical text, and segment units in oral text. The linguistics of the text cannot do without the analysis of phonetic and phonological means of organizing complex speech works. By Lev Zinder. Zinder considers the main feature of modern linguistics of the text, as well as of the old syntax of the sentence, an almost exclusive orientation towards the study of written text. He argues that written speech doesn't have sufficient means to convey the internal structure of the message, all the nuances of its meaning, the connotative and pragmatic aspects of the message. Even phonetic transcription cannot do this, since it is almost impossible to reflect all the richness of sound speech in writing, even phonetic. According to Zinder, the analysis of the phonetic and phonological properties of an oral text is the subject of a special section of supersegment phonology, whose task is to identify opposed in a given language forms that are relevant to expressing certain relations in the corresponding speech units. One of the tasks of the new section of intonology should be the establishment of those intonation means that, firstly, ensure the integrity of the unit of the text in a given language, and secondly, perform the function of connecting the elements of the corresponding units. Zinder suggested that the creation of an integral text unit is primarily the unity of pronunciation style, which includes such purely phonetic components as the rate of pronunciation, timbre, etc. The creation of a theory of styles of pronunciation in the specified understanding of this term is the primary task of general phonetics. To provide a semantic connection between different segments of the text, all components of intonation are used, which not only take on the function of a means of connecting one segment with other, but also to a certain extent predict the semantic structure of subsequent parts of the text. This position of Zinder found its confirmation in many experimental phonetic studies. Intonology can play an important role in identifying the phonetic characteristics of a text. The exclusive role of intonation in the organization of the oral text is determined by its three main functions: articulation, design, and emphasis. That is why the interest of scientists in the study of pause as the main means of dividing the text, melody that units the utterance into a single whole, and stress as a way of highlighting the individual components of the utterance does not dry out. All components of intonation contribute to the formation of holistic appearance of the text. One of the fruitful directions of the analysis of the sound characteristic of the text is the study of the connection between the actual division of the sentences with the text organization. The division of a sentence into a theme and rema, the intonation of a rema, and other phonetic features of an utterance are closely related to the structure of the entire text and the listener expectation of its continuation. This is especially clearly manifested in the text, which is in dialogical unity. It was thanks to Peshkovsky and his observations that the concepts of a complex whole and intonation unity were introduced into linguistic use. Peshkovsky's views on the peculiarities of the syntactic phonetic organization of a complex whole are distinguished by their freshness and ordinality. According to him, a complex whole, like other syntactic units, has its own intonation and its own rhythm. In general, the more complex the syntactic unit on which intonation and rhythm are layered, the more important they play in the language. Pishkovsky distinguished between pauses located inside complex wholes and pauses located between separate complex wholes. The difference between these two types is that in the first case, a pause can replace a union and it is used to link sentences. In the second case, the pause cannot be replaced by a union. It serves not to connect but to separate sentences. We are there in such a pause, we are over of some kind of sections, some kind of border separating one group of sentences from another. Thus, Pishkovsky already at that time drew attention to the pause as one of the phonetic means allowing to delimit from each other the segments of the speech chain that are larger than the sentence. According to Pishkovsky, connecting and dividing syntactic pauses are inextricably linked with their specific and very diverse intonations, which are also a more common means of splitting speech than pauses. While the connecting pause is always preceded by either a raising of the voice or partial lowering of various types, the dividing pause is always preceded by either a complete type of lowering of the voice or interrogative or exclamatory intonation. The result of Pishkovsky's reflection is the conclusion that the main intonation unit of speech is not a sentence or a complex whole, but a certain value, grammatically complex and simple, possessing one of three complete intonations: complete narrative, interrogative, or exclamation point. This value cannot be sentence because those sentences that are part of complex wholes are not internationally independent and can even in certain cases merge with neighboring parts of their complex wholes. This value also cannot correspond to a complex whole because an individual sentence can also have intonation completeness. Pishkovsky suggested calling this value an intonation unity, or more simply a phrase. By phrase, he understood any segment of speech from one dividing pause to another, regardless of how many sentences it consists of. A phrase, in turn, can be simple and complex, but the main thing is that this division doesn't coincide with the grammatical division of phrases into single sentences and complex wholes. Kandinsky was one of the first in Russia to attempt to consider the peculiarities of the influence of the contextual environment on the intonation structure of a sentence. In his approach, he was guided by the following theoretical principles. A complete speech work is a text that breaks up into smaller segments of speech, called syntactic completeness. A sentence in a contextual environment is characterized by an incomplete drop in tone, which is a sign of the influence of the context on the intonation of the sentences. A pause acts as a means of communication and division of sentences in the text, and its duration affects the perception of the text as monolithic or, on the contrary, as dismembered. Tension as a factor organizing a text can also be expressed by intonation means. One of the organizing features of the text is the emotional coloring of the sentences included in it. The most important result of the experimental research of Kandinsky can be considered as the recognition that the phonetic expression of completeness, incompleteness of utterance should not be identified with its semantic completeness, since the expression of the latter is achieved not only by intonation, but also by other linguistic means. The intonation of dialogical text, which is the product of the speech activity of two or more interlocutors, is greatly influenced by the uniqueness of the structural and syntactic construction of dialogical speech. Dialogue responses are interconnected and interdependent. The unity of the theme, which is a hallmark of any superphrasal unity, plays a well-known role in the dialogue, where it unites its participants. That is why the character of the intonation of the preceding remark can affect the formation of the intonation pattern of the subsequent remark. In a dialogical text, intonations means complementary semantic structures. However, there is no strict relationship between the intonation patterns of neighboring replicas. The character of the intonation of the subsequent replica can be prompted, but not imposed by the character of the intonation pattern of the previous replica. The data of linguistic literature give reason to say that certain components of intonation play a certain role in creating a single dialogical whole, dialogical unity. In the theory of dialogue, dialogical unity is understood as a unit analogous to a superphrasal unity or a complex syntactic whole isolated in monologue text. Melody. According to Nikolaeva, a universal means of melody, the most important component of intonation is the property of showing the coherence or incoherence of the components of the utterance. Experiments on the material of the English language in particular have shown that in the linguistic consciousness of native speakers, there is no rigid fixation of a certain melodic contour for a certain communicative type of utterance. The formation of an international pattern of utterance occurs under the influence of a whole complex of linguistic and situational parameters. Tempo. Experimental studies of the tempo of speech allow us to say that a stable tempo of pronunciation is one of the criteria for the international coherence of a dialogue replicas. The result of the analysis of the rate of pronouncing superphrasal unity on the material of monologue speech shows that at the level of superphrasal unity, the tempo of pronunciation remains stable. The slowdown is noted at the end of the phrase. Pause. It is known from linguistic literature that in monologue speech, the degree of connectivity of two syntaxes depends on the presence and size of a pause between them. Therefore, it is quite natural to assume that in dialogue speech, as the duration of the pause decreases until its disappearance, the connectedness of the component of the dialogical text will increase. The data of experimental phonetic studies of dialogue on the material of English language confirm, at last partially, the widespread point of view according to which the higher the level of syntactic unit, the longer pauses can separate them. These data, for example, show a tendency towards an increase in the duration of pauses in the chain, pauses of hesitation, intersyntagmatic pauses, pauses between utterances. Timbre. In phonetic, it is recognized that timbre serves only to express the emotional aspect of intonation. The acoustic expression of timbre is a spectral characteristic of sound. The timbre of a voice is characterized by the ratio of high frequency and low frequency components in its spectrum. Experiments show that there are significant differences in the timbre characteristics of the sounds of emotionally colored and neutral utterances, which confirms the qualification of timbre as one of the indicators of the speaker's emotional state. At the same time, the general timbre color is distinguished not by individual sounds, but rather extended segments, phrases, or even texts. Prosodic characteristics of speech can be indicators of the level of the speaker's speech culture. As you know, any text, especially an artistic one, is filled with personal meanings. It presents an individual vision of any problems and phenomena of reality by an individual native speaker. Accordingly, the culture of speech is not limited to mastering the vocabulary and grammar of a particular language. It also correlates with the concept of norms and functional styles of speech, and these are all phenomena applicable to whole speech works. Experiments show that the correlates of the level of speech culture of native speakers are such prosodic characteristics as melodic moment in a phrase, the rate of pronunciation, the frequency of its change, the nature of the dynamic and temporal contrast, the timbre of the voice and pause. At the same time, the assessment of the level of speech culture of speakers is primarily influenced by changes in the tempo of speech, the timbre coloration of the voice, and the size of the melodic intervals in the phrase. When analyzing the phonetic characteristics of the sounding text, first of all, attention is drawn to the question of the influence of the context on the individual parameters of individual sounds. This also includes the problem associated with finding out to what extent the general belonging of the text is reflected in the units of the segment level. These questions inevitably return us to the problem of complete and incomplete types of utterance, raised at one time by Scherba. In its most general form, the difference between the two types lies in the possibility or impossibility of an ambiguous phonemic interpretation of the sound elements of the spoken sections of speech. Moreover, if Scherba spoke about the type of pronunciation of the word as a whole, then later the concept of the type of pronunciation by the followers of the famous scientist began to refer not to the word but to the phoneme. According to Zinder, in spontaneous speech there is a variety of reduction of individual parts of the word, which leads, if not to the complete loss of individual phonemes, then to the so-called phonetic uncertainty, that is, to the possibility of different phonemic interpretation of the reduced segment. Then he says, in order for a word to be recognized, some part of it, that is, part of the phonemes that make up its appearance, must be pronounced in full type. Then, due to the redundancy of the language code, due to the action of the context, the rest of the phonemes pronounced in an incomplete type will be reconstructed. This is the mechanism for recognizing the units of spontaneous speech. Naturally, in order to resolve issues related to the identification of phonemes in the speech chain, most often a comparison is made of sound segments taken from text that differ from each other in terms of production. For example, a coherent text and isolated words, spontaneous and prepared text, spontaneous speech, reading, and telling, etc. Modern technical means make it possible to make an accurate and objective analysis of the background characteristics of the segment of the sound chain and to reveal the influence of the context on them. Below are some of the results obtained during the analysis of German and Russian speech material. The analysis of German sound in spontaneous monologue speech carried out by that, we can talk about the certain dependence of the phonetic realization of the smaller segment of speech on the communicative strategy of utterance. The study of the objective characteristics of sound on the material of the Russian language on stressed syllables. In this case, the variation can reach such a level that the vowel can take the acoustic form of another phoneme. A linguistic explanation of this phenomenon can be given only on the assumption that in the generation perception of coherent speech and isolated words, a person uses different speech mechanisms. Thus, the question of the distinctive function of vowels can be considered not from the standpoint of the phonetic of an isolated word, but in relation to the conditions of coherent speech. In connection with the development of computer technology and software, one of the urgent tasks of modern physics is the automatic processing of large arrays of sound material. This operation becomes possible only with the use of the latest speech signal analysis tools, among which automatic segmentation takes one of the leading places. Answer the question, please. What are the objectives of the super segment phonology section? Which elements serve to create a cohesive text unity? What provides a semantic connection between different sections of text? Thank you for attention.